Yes, I think there is an appetite. I mean, very simply, if the promise of the right return for the perceived level of risk is there, investors will tend to come and find you. I mean, we part of our business, although I'm in the research business, a big part of our business is providing advice to both projects and companies looking for funding, both private, public, debt and equity. And the issues are clearly there for around these risks, both perceived and actual. And we are seeing progress. We write research on a company called Atome, for example, which has fairly recently announced the non-binding heads of terms on equity for 50% of its project in Paraguay. And this is well, it started life as a clean ammonia project, but has now moved to a clean fertilizer project. And that feels like it's moving in the right direction. And you know, the elements there, you know, I think as Matt said, is, you know, is offtake there? Is offtake reliable? Is it secured? Can investors believe in it? Are the inputs right? Obviously, in this case, it's a long-term PPA, power purchase agreement, into the project. I'm beginning to get actually increased signs of concern around water input as well. Particularly in countries where the impact of climate change is affecting the issue with water as well. And then EPC, again, as Matt said, although it's interesting, we have actually successfully funded a project, sadly not in the hydrogen space, but in the biomethane space, where there wasn't an EPC wrap. In fact, there wasn't an EPC wrap and there wasn't a feedstock contract, although the project itself was big enough in the market. The size gave it market buying power, which to an extent reduced that feedstock risk. But it does tell you that, you know, investors, and both debt and equity, and this had a considerable debt tranche to it. Investors are prepared to invest if they can get comfortable around the risk and if the return is right for that risk. It's putting these things together that I think can be challenging. I think one of the big areas we're seeing a lot of interest in at the moment are around e-fuels, particularly with, you know, hard mandates for sustainable aviation fuel, and with shipping going into the European Emissions Trading Scheme and the Fuel EU process. And just next week we've got the IMO's key Maritime Emissions Committee meeting. It could be that we see tougher standards from the IMO as well, which itself will drive real demand, because shippers will need to look for fuels, and we see a big move towards methanol, both biogenic methanol and e-methanol. Of course, e-methanol is a big user of hydrogen, although even on the biogenic side, we are seeing some projects where the biogenic process is augmented by electrolyzers to bring in hydrogen as well to increase the yield for the project. But of course, particularly with e-fuels, you're trying to, unlike doing, say, a plain vanilla wind project, where you know there's a single offtake into an electricity grid, it's really quite almost one-dimensional. The dimensions you're dealing with on a lot of these projects create complexity, particularly if they're not linked, because your input of power may be a separate project, and it may be a greenfield brand new project as well that requires funding. Your offtake may be from hydrogen into something downstream in the process, which then itself is relying on offtake. And I think that degree of complexity is one of the things that we see as making life difficult for people. It can be overcome, and of course there are people, and this is what we saw with the Atome project, started off making ammonia, but it is now essentially downwardly integrated into actually making the fertilizer, removing a level of risk in doing that, and so far it looks like successfully doing so. So yeah, these are these are the sort of challenges we say. Is not to take away from what Matt says about regulation, because everything is wrapped around regulation as well. As I say, you know, the interest waiting for the IMO is waiting for regulation of one form, and yeah, we'll see what they say. I think the other thing you know we've experienced around offtake. I'm based in the UK, the hydrogen allocation round for HAR1. You know, I think every bidder was supposed to have absolutely secure offtake, and that offtake has not been seen to be as perhaps secure as it might have been, for all the reasons I think we know about. And I did feel actually with some of those rounds and some of the nature of hydrogen. We've one of our things is to write research thematic notes for investors to educate around themes in the sector. And one of the things we looked at hydrogen was the feasibility of running hydrogen in a flexible mode, because power prices vary every half hour. Well, actually, technically, the supply and demand curve varies every 20 milliseconds in a 50 hertz system, and that's a lot of variation. But that gives you an opportunity, if you trade that power, to buy power very cheaply if you're prepared not to run at full utilization. And we think there are games that can be played there for those willing to take those risks. But the market tends to be set up with this concept of let's do everything in long-term power purchase agreements, and let's have the output in long-term agreements. I think it was a shame that in the hydrogen allocation rounds, risk-taking intermediaries, for example, were not allowed to be there as off-takers. I suspect over time the world could evolve to having a very different model, looking probably more like the oil industry. And I think that could see different types of capital coming into the market. And in some ways, it works quite well with the nature of the electricity system, which of course is the key input to producing hydrogen. On Tuesday, I was in Belfast seeing a Northern Ireland Water site, which has put an electrolyser in from clean power hydrogen. Northern Ireland, as part of the whole Irish electricity system, is seeing wind curtailment up to 38%. So that's a lot of free power if you can actually set things up to use it. And because essentially the project there, it's a pilot project, but it should be able to run flexibly and take advantage of that. So I think there's a lot of interesting things to go and look at. Getting them financed is a challenge, but there are people doing things out there, and I think that that gives me a good feeling of optimism around the sector.